afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Hashtag No Limits. I am your host, Shelly Kino. Hashtag No Limits is a program that was developed in order to hopefully change the world's perspective of people with different, unique abilities. I have so many times in my career seen people who have had limits placed upon them by society, but who have busted through those limits. And in my own life, I unintentionally had limits on people who learned differently than I did. And it took me way too long for my perspective to change. And so I started this show a couple of, I guess, during the pandemic, so about a year and a half ago, to try to help other people have their perspective changed in a faster way than what my perspective was changed. And so this show is just talking to people who've had those limits placed upon them, who have busted through those limits, or maybe a support person of someone who's busting those limits. And so today I have Sandy with me, and Sandy is a mom. She's an advocate. She has done the Master IEP Coach Mentorship just like I did. And she's just an amazing person. And I'm so excited to have her on today and to have her just talk about what her life is like and what has what perspective she can bring to the table. Sandy, thank you for joining me. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on, Shelly. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to just chatting with you for a while.
Yeah, so Sandy and I haven't officially met. We were just talking before we went live that we actually get to meet in person in a couple of months. We have our Master IEP Coach Conference, and so we're both very thrilled about that. But as I said, Sandy and I have both taken this mentorship course, and we took it at different times. So but even before she did that, she was just also telling me that she was already an advocate prior to that. So kind of tell us how your whole life has gotten from point A to point B.
From point A to point B. I was born a child in a small town. No, I'm just kidding.
You go right ahead. You tell the whole thing.
Right ahead. So my world and my relationship with the world of special education began through my son, William. And Will, who is now 22, almost going to be 23 in a couple weeks.
Sorry.
Time flies. I know. Yeah. So Will's autistic. And I recognized that there was something just kind of off. Something was just not quite right when I would see him playing with his peers in like the play group, and he would do the parallel play. He wouldn't want to really interact with them too much, and he would line up all his little toys in a straight line, and he would play with things in an inappropriate manner that just something was just not quite right. But he was a really smart kid. He was completely verbal. Met all the other milestones. And by the age of 3, his obsession was always animals. And by the age of 3, he could tell you the difference between monkeys and apes and the fact that monkeys had prehensile tails and what a prehensile tail was. I had to go look it up.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, and you would quiz me on that right now. I wouldn't have been able to tell you.
Exactly. Well, it means that it's like a finger.
Okay.
So...
All right.
And I learned that from my 3-year-old son at the time. And it was because he was taking in all this information from videos that he would watch and just parroting things. Mm-hmm. So we embarked on, the course of having him evaluated and trying to figure out what exactly was going on with him. And by the time, and it took us a couple of years to get the right diagnoses. The first diagnoses came from a pediatric neurologist that said, "Oh, he's just ADHD. Here's your prescription." I was like, okay, no. This is not where we're going. My child can attend to a task and sit and pay attention to something when it's something he's interested in, for half an hour to an hour at a time. So I knew that it wasn't a hyperactivity issue. I knew that there was something else behind it. And so we kept persisting with just different medical professionals until ultimately we found the pediatric psychologist that said, he's got some telltale signs. Read this pamphlet. Tell me what you think while I'm in here evaluating him. And it was at that time called Asperger's. So, I guess by today's standards, it would be level 1 autism. So just very high functioning, but he was like the little professor and just saw the world very black and white terms and didn't understand the nuances of language sometimes. And when somebody was making jokes about language like that involved certain statements like, oh, carrots, they're really good for your eyes. And he would say, yeah, but I put them in my mouth, so like those things. So once we had that official diagnosis and we saw how it started impacting him in school, then we started asking for help from the school team. And that began the entire fun IEP process of let's sign consent, let's do evaluations, let's look at this. And at the meeting to determine his eligibility, once we had done all of those processes and things for the last like 3-4 months, we sat down with the team to determine his eligibility. And the district staffing specialist that was present, because of my involvement with the school and because I was always around and things, we had developed kind of a rapport. So I guess she felt comfortable to just kind of joke with me. And when we looked at the area of eligibility for autism, she said, oh, he's just not messed up enough for that.
Oh, dear.
And that was like a gut punch, honestly. Yeah, that was, and I was like, what, excuse, like, what? Did you just say what I think you just said? And, my husband and I joke about this, that I thank heavens that he was next to me because I would have flown across the table.
Yeah.
But, and ultimately what she meant to say, but failed spectacularly to do so, is that there are certain criteria that need to be met for all the different areas of eligibility and will happen to not meet the criteria the way that it was outlined at that time for autism. Ultimately, we've had him found eligible under a different area of eligibility, which was other health impairment, which is just kind of like a blanket term that just encompasses all sorts of other things. And that was the first ice bath that I received of, okay, this is going to be a long road going through his educational career, and me not understanding what the professionals are telling me, because you're sitting as a parent, you're sitting at that IEP table across from the educational team, across from the school psychologist, district members, speech therapists, people that have gone to school for umpteen years and do this on a regular basis. You take them for their word and you believe that they do know all the ins and outs of the nuances of all these procedures and documents and things.
Right.
And I felt that I needed to get more information so that I could at least hold my ground, so that I at least knew what questions were the right questions to ask and what information was I missing. And, over the next few years, I did a lot of workshops and a lot of research and just looked things up. And after a period of time, I ended up actually working back in the school system as a paraprofessional. And ultimately, I ended up as a school librarian. And at that school where I was working as a librarian, because I'm fully bilingual, they would bring me in to the IEP meetings to help translate for the Spanish-speaking families, because they knew that I had a background in this. They knew my personal experience. My son was a middle schooler at this point, so they know that I'd been down this road for years, and I knew the nuances of the rules and laws and what have you. And so they would bring me in to the meeting to act as the interpreter for the parents. But then they realized that I was actually going a little bit above and beyond and explaining things to them and explaining the procedures, not just doing the literal translations of what everybody was saying.
Yeah.
And, someone mentioned to me, like, I think you missed your calling. I really do think you missed your calling. And that was just a light bulb moment for me. And so that's when I decided to become a professional advocate.
And for anyone that is watching, she did talk about how long of a process this was. And Sandy, you didn't go into all of those times that I'm sure you had to have of, why is this so difficult? Why doesn't the school just want to help my child? What am I missing? What am I, all of the, so I'm just going to ask you, did you have times like that in that process? Did you ever want to give up? And if you did, what kept you going forward?
There were times, to this day, sometimes, being the parent of an autistic young adult is still not easy. And those are the times that you need to just dig in and say, okay, I need to put my personal feelings on the shelf. I need to just recognize that this isn't me versus this school team. This is not me. I just need to understand. I get it that you guys have procedures. Explain these procedures to me and the why for these procedures. And there are so many rules and regulations that are outlined by the Department of Education that guide how these IEPs, how these documents are written, that I just needed to understand more in depth what it was that I didn't know about it. And that's not to say that the parent that is sitting at home that is perhaps a paralegal in a law office or a dental assistant or somebody that works in accounting, that's not to say that everyone that has a child in the world of special education needs to go that deep into this, but it's important to know that you do have your rights. You do have specific steps that you're entitled to and that you can follow as a parent of a child with special education needs. But the most important thing is you have the right to bring whoever you want with you to the meetings to help explain that. And that's where you and I step in. That's where people like ourselves can pitch in and help out and help either behind the scenes, coaching and explaining the process and the procedures to the parents, or sitting there with them shoulder to shoulder at that meeting. And when necessary, pausing the meeting and saying, wait a second, did you understand that? Is there a question that you have? Because those were the things that I missed out on and that I wished I would have had when my son was 6, 7, 10, 15 years old. You don't know what it is you don't know. And it's intimidating sitting across from the team there at the table.
Absolutely. And I was a special education teacher as my background. And so I had been part of the education team at these meetings. The first time I went to a meeting with a parent after I stopped teaching, I was still nervous and like, oh my gosh, they are talking so fast and I know what they're talking about. And I'm still having a hard time catching all the little things. And it isn't that it's done intentionally. It's done intentionally, but it's not done intentionally to try to confuse or, make it more difficult. There's a lot of summarizing because there is so much information and there's a lot of assuming that parents know things. And I don't even think oftentimes that that's intentional. It's just, as educators, we have our speak. We know what we're thinking in our head, and we forget that the people that are sitting across from us or next to us aren't in our head and don't speak what we speak.
Exactly. It's like you almost go on autopilot. And in many cases, the staff, and because I too worked in the school system, I get both sides of the table. I understand it. And I'm sympathetic to the school team's perspective as well, where sometimes they've got 15 meetings to get through in 1 week. And so if the parent isn't stopping them, and not that they're doing this on purpose to rush through, but if the parent isn't stopping them, they're just assuming, okay, you got it. You know what I'm talking about? Good. Then let's just go through beep, 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 beep. All right, we're done. No, you need to take your time. And, no one explaining to me that I had the right to just stop the meeting and say, wait a second, go back, because what is an FBA? What are you talking about? That you're going to do an FBA? What does that mean? You're asking me to agree to something and to sign, but I want to understand A, what it is, and B, how is that going to help my child?
Exactly.
So, a functional behavior assessment where they're then going to, collect data to determine what the child's behaviors are and if there's, any kind of a pattern to it and what the function behind it is and how to possibly retrain the child out of those behaviors for, to have them be more successful in school. No one explained that to me initially. It was just here, sign on the dotted line. It was like, wait, hold on a second. So those are important lessons for parents to learn. And it's something that, what's one of our fellow master IEP coaches, the phrase IEPs are my jam. And that's what I love, having those conversations with parents and having those teachable moments and watching that light bulb go off like, oh, okay, I get it now.
And
That's huge.
and there's so much, and I don't know about you because you actually had more of an advocacy role before you took the mentorship class with Catherine. But for me, I thought I knew the special ed law, like I said, with all my years of teaching and all the meetings and all the IEPs that I'd written. And I was always interested in keeping up with the, latest and greatest things that were happening in the law. And so when I took the mentorship, I was thinking, I don't really need that special ed stuff. I just need the stuff that she talks about business wise.
Right.
I'm still constantly like 4 years later, blown away when she says, oh, well, have you thought about this? No.
Exactly. Exactly.
And yeah, she's amazing. And she definitely, she has a wonderful way of looking at things. She has a great perspective. And
that's
so,
something that
I
greatly appreciated because I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's okay, you're fine.
Because I ended up working for a company that just hired out IEP advocates. I became a senior IEP advocate. I'd done trainings and I'd done lots of courses, and I did that for, going on 5 years, almost 6 years. And you're always finding the new, you're always finding the changes, you're always finding that different perspective. And when I took Catherine's mentorship last summer, was when I just decided to just kind of change my business model a little bit. And I went to work for myself, and I started trying to also focus more on helping the bilingual community and helping the Spanish speaking families and things. And especially with the pandemic, we realized, oh my gosh, families need help now more than ever, because this whole virtual learning that we're going to embark upon, like that was something that nobody had ever experienced. But going back to the Master IEP Coach mentorship, I had already taken courses and I was already actively working as an advocate. And I still learned things and different perspectives and different ways of viewing things that I had never done before. And I just found it so refreshing. And one of the perspectives that I appreciate the most is trying to emphasize the collaboration with the school team.
Yes.
That was something that was so refreshing to me. And I've employed that in my day-to-day business model. And are there times that things can go sideways and you have to get a little more forceful with the team, or you've got to dig in your heels because you recognize that something's not right? Absolutely.
Right.
But when you approach the table with a collaborative mindset, and when you have good communication in advance of what your expectations are, not only with the family, but with the school team as well, like, listen, this is what we're going to be talking about. This is what we're requesting. And then just sit down and have a genuine, respectful give and take of, okay, this is what we're requesting. You disagree? Show me the data. Tell me why you disagree.
Right.
Not challenging them in, a forceful way, but just respectfully, okay, explain your perspective to me. Explain your position. Why? Because this is our position. This is why the parent is asking for this for their child. Can you explain to me and to the parent why you don't feel they need that? Right. And that's just refreshing.
Yeah, it absolutely. And I'll be honest, when I first came out of teaching, I was bitter towards some of my gen ed colleagues, because so much, yes, I went to school and I had the special education degree, so mine was a little bit more specialized, but I also had an elementary degree. And so I, without realizing I was doing it, thought that, I had to learn a lot of what I do with my students on the job.
Oh, yeah.
Because they can't teach you everything that you need to know in a college, because, I feel like I don't even know, I can't even put a time frame on it, but we're always seeming to add more disabilities of, that children have, and there's more and more rare things and how it affects their learning. And, so there's no way to know, like, there's not just, okay, do this for this, and do that, and this is going to work for here. And, but oftentimes I would get frustrated with my gen ed colleagues because I didn't feel like they were willing to do some of that. And so I did have more of I'm going to go work for the parents, and I'm going to make these gen ed teachers do what they've not been doing all this time. And then I took that mentorship, and just the way she presented everything, and the collaboration. And I was like, oh gosh, she's right. And so that shifted my mindset regarding that. And I can now be empathetic towards the gen ed teachers in the sense of, yeah, you guys don't have a lot of training, but yet the law says you have to accept everybody into your classroom. And you don't know how to help everybody. And so you probably are fearful that you're going to mess it up, or that, all the effort that you've put into it is still not going to be able to reach this child. And, then you're going to feel like a failure. And, just a whole different mindset of and so now when I go into schools, how I approach gen ed teachers and special ed teachers, because some of the districts that I've represented families or partnered with families, the special ed teachers didn't know what they were doing either. And then I thought, well, yeah, here's me. I had all these years of experience. I was interested in the law. I was always kept up to date with that kind of stuff.
Right.
And yet I got into that mentorship and I learned, and it's not that she teaches like, oh, this is the law and, da, 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 da. It's the embrace the law, but also expand the box of thinking, think outside the box of how can we make this work? And, yes, there are things that are underlying things. Like you said, show me the data,
right?
That is so huge. And that was just sort of like, oh, I have to ask people for that. Like they should just know that, but they don't. They,
I agree.
So
and one of the things that I'll never forget, one of my first meetings, not long after the mentorship, where I then, collaborated with the team of, okay, let's ask, we're requesting something specific for the student. I asked for them to demonstrate the data that supported the fact that the student didn't need it. Well, no, they didn't have it. So, okay, we ended up collaborating on a SMART goal for this student. Then afterwards, I said to them, okay, so now how is this going to be implemented? Like, well, it's just, we're going to scaffold the course and we're just going to, implement. Okay, no, but how often are you going to work with them on this specific goal? How many times a week? And how are you going to let the parent know? So like having them think about having to break that down further. And sometimes it's met with resistance because it's just viewed as, one more thing for them to do. It's one more thing for that poor teacher to have to collect data on and to have to, keep track of and things. I get it. Like you said, we've both been on the school side of things, and teachers are under an inordinate amount of pressure and do have a lot on their plates. But when you have those parameters, I think if you look at it from the different perspective of, oh, these are the things that I have to do. If you flip the perspective on that and think, oh, this is the way I can do this more effectively, you just take the negative out of it. That can just make a huge difference in not only in the teacher's perspective at how they are approaching their job, but also how they're reaching out to that student. Because no matter how hard they try, we're human. We're human.
Absolutely.
We are fallible creatures. And if you are frustrated and you resent having to do all these extra steps, it's going to shine through.
You're right.
It's going to shine through, and that child is going to pick up on that negative undertone, or sometimes the genuine need for blowing off steam to their partner, to the co-teacher, or to the paraprofessional, and just make the off statements out of frustration, and it's overheard by the student.
Right.
And that student just, it's kind of, like a little dagger in their heart there.
Right.
That their teacher is frustrated. So flipping the perspective about IEPs, instead of looking at them as something negative and challenging and just one more thing to do, it's looking at it from a perspective of, this is my roadmap of how my job could be easier to be able to help the student if I just follow these steps. That can be a game changer. And like you said, I have friends that are gen ed teachers that didn't have all the additional training a special ed teacher receives sometimes. And there's just so much that is not explained to them, or that they don't know about the process or how to dive into this a little deeper and make it more effective for their classroom management.
Yeah. And having the discussion with the full team about who's responsible for implementing this goal, or for taking the data on it, or what you just said, how is this going to look, is to me also a game changer, because there were so many times when, as a teacher, I would leave a meeting and I would think, okay, well, maybe this is a student that I don't see as much, because they're included, a much bigger chunk of their day than with me. And so I was thinking that the gen ed teacher would be making the accommodations and taking the data. And the gen ed teacher would think, well, Shelley's the special ed teacher. That
Right.
falls under her umbrella.
Yep.
And then it would become a tiff between us. Well, no, you have to do this. Well, no, you should be doing this, And if we had discussed these things with the entire team, we could have had that objective look at it. And then whatever the team decides is what we would have both followed.
Right.
And so now that I'm able to go into meetings and ask those questions and get those clarifications for not just the education team, but also so the parent really understands, like, oh, okay, well, if I have a question about the data, then I go to this person. Right. If I have a question about an accommodation or a particular goal, maybe I go to somebody different and it's this person.
Right.
And so keeping that parent an equal member of the team too is so huge. And going all the way back to the question that I had asked before we went on.
I'm so sorry.
No. I've done this a couple of times where I get on a Catherine, putting her up on a pedestal kick because she does. So you as the parent, then, you did have those times, but in your experience, would you say you had more positive, more negative, or do you think you kind of had an even keel as far as good and bad experiences?
I think it was probably even.
Good.
The earlier years, even after that initial foray into the world, or the welcome into the world of special education, he's not messed up enough.
It's not messed up enough.
But there were times when there were phenomenal school teams, especially in the elementary years and the early middle school years, where, everybody was on the same page. I understood their perspective. They got my child. There were times when I had to push and, fight, for lack of a better phrase, for certain things that I didn't understand why, like my poor kid could not write. You couldn't read his handwriting, but they would not qualify him for school-based OT services because he didn't meet the criteria. Like, he could put a pencil to paper, he could write his name, he could write just fine. It was just the fact that his penmanship was awful and it was illegible. And that was not what the school-based OT services were meant for. They were just meant to help cover the bare minimum and what was academically relevant. So, those kind of little, moments like that were the ones where I would grow very frustrated, and I still wouldn't understand why. Like, you just need to be able to help my child. That's all I'm asking, is why are you resisting helping my child? Yeah. But then when I would see the data, and when they would, demonstrate different things that, look, but he is capable of doing this. Yes. Does it look great? No, but look, his teacher can read it function perfectly. They understand. Oh, okay, fine. So that's it. There was a meeting of the minds there, but even all the way through high school, when I was already a advocate professionally, there were times when his IEP accommodations were not offered during EOC exams and of course exams, or during an AP exam. Yeah, those were good times. That's when the mama bear comes out, and the hoop earrings come off, and and I'm going to have to come in there and fight for my kid. So it was always a blend of both. I did have some wonderful school teachers and teams that worked with my kids, but then there were times that did require to roll up your sleeves and get in there to dig in for what he needed.
Yeah. And so can you give advice to, or maybe just tell what you did other than rolling up your sleeves and taking off the hoop earrings? For those parents who are maybe listening and saying, well, I know that my child's accommodations weren't given for, a state test or a classroom assessment even. How would you advise them? What were some things that you did that worked? And we all know that just because it worked for you, or maybe it didn't work for you, let them know the pitfalls and also the successes. But I mean, it may not work for them, but at least maybe it'll give them something else to try or another route to go.
Well, the first thing is, depending on the age of the child, I think it's very important to have that conversation with your child about their educational needs, what their IEP is. You don't have to get into all the nuances and the details, and parents will know their child best and what their level of understanding is. But once your child is old enough to understand and they do have a cognitive level of that they can appreciate some of these things, advocating for themselves is huge, and asking it to speak up for yourself. So that was one thing that Will was always really good at. If he recognized that he was supposed to have extended time and they didn't offer it to him, he would raise his hand and he would ask for it.
That's awesome.
So that was huge. Not every child does that. But when I would get the feedback same day or a couple of days later, then I would email the team. And that is something that I always recommend to parents, that when you have a doubt about something that has been denied your child, has been offered your child, has anything that you have a question about their educational plan and whether or not these services and supports have been offered to your child, put it in writing and email the teacher and CC on it all the pertinent parties that have something to do with what's going on there. If it is a service provider, if it's the gen ed teacher and the ESE teacher, if it is the speech language pathologist that needs to be CC'd. And in the case of when an accommodation was not offered for a high stakes test like that, you better believe that I also CC'd the principal on that email as well. And that was handled within 12 hours. My son, actually, they ended up letting him finish his exam the following day.
Oh, wonderful.
So that was huge. And because I put the right statements together and said, let them know, this is something that is outlined in my child's educational plan. This is an accommodation that he is to be provided. He has been provided this accommodation all year long. And now during the time of high stakes testing, I need you to demonstrate to me that you did give him this opportunity. And if you didn't, why? I want to know the why. Show me the policy. Show me, how you're going to help fix this situation. I'm willing to work with you guys, but how are you going to propose to fix this? That's huge, is, I'm willing to work with you, but we need to make this right. Absolutely.
And I want to say something, and I should have said it it was on my mind to say it, and then I got sidetracked and said something else. But what you talked about when you went to your very first meeting is you're sitting, at this table, and there's all these experts. You have the therapist, you have the administration, you had teachers. And something that I've been trying to get teachers to understand and parents to own is that you are the expert in your child.
Exactly.
You said it. These other people at the table have gone to school for years, and they might have years of experience in education or therapy, whatever their role is at the table. But you have had your child every day from the moment they were born. And those little nuances about them as far as something's off and why, this is not their norm. So what's going on? Exactly. And you've learned those, this is how he learns best, or this is how she studies best. And to be able to bring that information to the table is just as valid and as important as whatever the educators have to say. And yeah, you're right. A lot of what I find that I do for families is give them the language to speak that the educators understand. And so that leads me to, because you help a lot of Spanish speaking families.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that. Like, tell us, are they over identified, under identified? We'll start with that one.
So that's a mixed bag.
Okay.
When earlier on in my career, I felt that they were, and earlier on, even when my child was, diagnosed as autistic, I think that in the Hispanic and in the Latin community, largely they were under-identified. And
Okay.
I think that may have been in part due to just culture and the fact that it's a very difficult thing to look at your child and think there's something, quote unquote, wrong with them, even though there is absolutely nothing wrong with a child that has a learning disability. They just, they're viewing the world. And with Will, I always used to tell him he's just viewing the world in a different way. His brain just operates slightly differently. That's just something that can sometimes in minority communities be difficult to accept. And I don't know if it's that, they view themselves as needing to just push harder and work harder for what they're achieving. And then there's the language barriers that sometimes they're intimidated by the process. And I think that they've largely I'm not speaking very good English today.
Well, I would tell you to say it in Spanish, but then I wouldn't have a clue what you were saying.
Exactly. But I think that time was that they largely went unidentified.
Yeah.
And that I've seen a positive trend where they are being identified more often. And these children are going and being evaluated. And I've had a lot of families that are actually transplants, for example, that moved from Puerto Rico. And when they came over to Florida, they brought their IEPs from Puerto Rico with them. And they were just kind of lost with the little bit of the language barrier. And they needed that help understanding the nuances of how, despite the fact that they're still, part of a U.S. territory and that IEPs are international. It doesn't matter what country a student is coming from, even if they're German. If they've got an education plan, they've got their specific rights. It's helping the parent understand that process. Something that was huge for my bilingual families is for them to understand that they're entitled to receive certain copies of their documents in their native language, like their procedural safeguards. They're entitled to receive a copy of that in Spanish so that they can actually take the time to read it and help them understand that better.
Right.
And that was just something that was a lightning bolt moment for me of, okay, these families are not getting it and they need help. They need to understand that these are resources that are available to their child out there and to them as the parent. And I need to help them access this.
Right. And I know that things are a little bit easier. I almost said a lot easier, but I think it's only a little bit easier with, programs like Google Translate for those documents to be put into all the different languages. Because it is supposed to be in a family's native language. But I can remember when I first started teaching and I think it was a Spanish speaking family. And at that time, it wasn't in the law yet that they had to, that they had the right to receive like their procedural rights and safeguards in Spanish. And I thought, but how are they going to understand? We had an interpreter at the meeting, but then they went home. Right. And they had all these, I don't know how thick it is, but I remember ours here in Illinois was 10 or 12 pages and it was tiny little print and front and back. And it's very overwhelming. And that would be like if you gave it to me in Spanish,
you'd be lost.
Right. And I wouldn't take the time to translate it or find somebody to translate it for me. I would just go, oh, well, okay, I guess they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. And that was just so important for the families to feel that support and for the families to feel that they finally had somebody on their side, because I've got one of my clients that actually I've worked with her several times throughout the school year. Once she started bringing an advocate with her to the meetings, suddenly they would send a district translator to participate in the meetings, whereas before she only had somebody that was a staff member translating back and forth, kind of like what I used to do when I worked for the schools. And she knew enough of the language, and she knew and understood enough of English that she said, I know that she's not translating every single thing that they're saying to me. And I know that I'm missing out on some of these things, and that she's not explaining things the way that I'm stating them. She's not, translating my statements verbatim. So that was one of the things that I requested, and I brought that to the table. And so they have been providing someone that it takes a really long time during the meeting, but because this was a very specific concern of the parents, this person literally translates every aspect of the meeting. So, somebody will speak and somebody will give a response, and then we have to pause. And that person is almost like a court reporter. They are reading the literal translation of everything that's taking place in that meeting. And it doesn't always have to be that way, but that is something that the parents need to know, that is a resource that is available to them.
Yeah.
And that they're entitled to. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I've had a couple of meetings where, and I'm not 100% sure that it was really legal the way that they brought an interpreter in. I mean, I've had siblings of the child, an older sibling, come in. And a lot of the schools where I've worked in have been K-8 buildings. Yes. And so I can remember a student was a 7th or 8th grader and had a 3rd or 4th grade sibling. And we brought the 7th or 8th grader in to be the translator for his parents. And I thought, okay, I don't really think this is the right way to do this. But at the time, like I said, it wasn't, it was said that it had to be interpreted. It wasn't, it didn't give a specific, like it has to be someone who is an interpreter, because that's different as well, because I would think, at least if you're very familiar with one group or the other group, you might throw some slang in or throw some, like a word that you think, oh, they're going to know what I'm talking about, but it doesn't maybe absolutely translate that way. Whereas a interpreter that's hired, that's, an objective party, I wouldn't think would do that, but I don't know, maybe they would, but. And
it was really interesting because in all my years of doing this, is the first time that I've had one that took her job that seriously and then was verbatim translating everything. And I gave her mad props, because that was quite a job. But, when there is enough confidence on both sides of the table, if you have someone that is, for example, the Spanish teacher or the SLP or, the speech pathologist or someone else that is a staff member that is fluent in the language and can speak to the parent and translate both sides, and the parent feels confident, I think it's important to ask the parent what's their comfort level with that as well. And if the parent is not comfortable with that and wants to make sure that something's not being missed, then bring your own friend or neighbor or, or an advocate or someone with you to make sure that, you're understanding everything and that both sides are hearing the other side's perspective.
Yes. And I would think that's even more critical when there's a language difference. I mean, it's already difficult when both parties are speaking English. But like I said, educators have, just like every field has their own acronyms and their own, shortcuts of saying things. And I found that even going into different districts, or like, I forget now what it was that you said before. And I was like, oh yeah, that's like an East Coast way to say what I would say is this here in the Midwest.
The FBA, the functional behavior system.
It might, did you say like the EC teacher? Maybe do you have
ESE teacher?
Okay, so I mean,
exceptional student education. That's how we call it here in Florida. It's the ESE teacher,
right?
Which is a special ed teacher, basically.
Right. Yeah, and that's just. I mean, we're just special ed teachers in the Midwest, and like the different being able to work in the different states. like we're able to, even that, it's like, okay, I need you to stop because I don't know what you're saying. And I'm sure if I don't know what you're saying, the parent doesn't know what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And it's just, because it's difficult enough with just both people speaking English, I would think it's even more critical that both sides, or I hate to say sides, but everybody at the table understands
exactly
what is being said, because you do want to have that trust and that collaboration, that everything is the way it's supposed to be. And, and probably in your situation, when you were telling the parents a little bit more that, like, kind of their
right.
some of their rights and how the procedures would go,
right.
Maybe the school didn't want you doing that. And
that's, the principal, she knew enough Spanish to get that I was kind of oversharing. And, and that's when, she genuinely made the comment to me. She said, "You've missed your calling, because these are the families that need you."
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. Of course, I don't know that she was expecting me to hand in my resignation the following year, but it's like, well, I liked what you said, and so I'm going to take you up on it, and I'm gone. It's like, wait, no, don't go.
Yeah, that's not what I meant.
Right.
Yeah.
But and honestly, it's not a matter of the school team wanting to hide things or wanting to not be as forthcoming with the parent. Sometimes it's a matter of that they just, again, cut and dry, and let's cut to the chase, and let's just knock this out and get out of here. But if the parent is not understanding every aspect of what's being explained at the table, it doesn't matter what language it's being presented in. The parent needs to be given, meaningful input. That's the way it states it in the law. They need to have meaningful input into the IEP process. And, I said, that's the way it states in the law. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV.
Right, same here.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm just married to one, but that's not me, So, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's, there's so many nuances to it that the parents need to understand what their rights are. And that's what we love helping them with.
Yeah. And like I have, we're talking about one special education law. Okay. So this is the rights law version of the book, but look how thick that is.
I've got some of mine up here too for rights law.
Right. So there's no possible way that parents who don't have, years of experience at this are going to be able to understand all the nuances within the law.
Right.
And go ahead.
And they don't necessarily have to understand every aspect of it either. I always caution parents, like, don't be intimidated by it. It's okay. Right. You don't have to understand each and every aspect of it. Number one, that's why you've called me. Or number two, there's resources out there. You can learn a lot of these things. Sometimes it does take having an advocate or an IEP coach on your side to help, and it just kind of smooths the path and makes things a little bit easier. But parents, it's so important to just arm yourselves with knowledge and learn as much as you can. Absolutely.
Yeah, most definitely. So we've got about 10 or 12 minutes. So tell us some of the things, some of those limits that may have been placed on your son that he has busted through, and then tell us what he's up to these days.
So Will, over the years, like about a year after we got his IEP, there was a whole rezoning going on in our district, and they were trying to place him at a different school. And I was, kind of fighting to keep him where he was. And I received a phone call from the special ed teacher at the new school they were recommending, saying, "Oh yeah, I heard that, you guys I'm here to answer any questions. And yeah, we've got a place for him in the autism unit, and it's just going to be great." And I was like, "Whoa, wait, what do you mean?" And I found out inadvertently that they were going to propose to put him in a self-contained classroom setting.
Oh.
And I said, "Well, no, that's not where my son belongs. He's in the general education setting. He does receive," and that's, just there's different ways that special education services can be offered to children.
Right.
The way that my son received it was he received pull-out service, meaning that the two subjects that he struggled in the most, which were math and organizational skills and things, they would pull him out and work with him one-on-one, but he was in the general education setting for the rest of the day. And he demonstrated that he struggled. The poor guy had a hard time, but he demonstrated that he was perfectly capable of that. And he went through his whole school career in the general education setting with a lot of supports and services in place. He graduated with a regular general education diploma. He's been plugging along slowly but surely at his associate's degree at the college. And it's been a few years still because he really needed that setting of the support and that environment of the set schedule of the school year, and having the teachers kind of reaching out to him and touching base with him when assignments were missing and stuff. You don't get that as well in college as you used to. And so he's had to learn to advocate for his accommodations for himself in the college setting, where when your child graduates from high school, the IEP essentially goes away, because they're not providing your child a service, but they can still provide accommodations. So like the extra time and things. So he's had to learn how to go to the disability services office and ask and provide them the paperwork. And I do help him with these things, but we've tried to foster that independence in him.
Yeah.
He's got a part-time job at a dog daycare that he absolutely loves. And he's been there for over a year. And we're still, plugging away at those independent living skills and things that he just needs a little more help with. One of the things that I've come to realize over the years is that the young autistics, as they age out of high school and as they age out of that day-to-day support in the school setting, the transition to adulthood is very challenging. And there are fewer supports and adequate services for them out there, depending on the level of need. When you have a level 1 autistic like my son, or that used to be called Asperger's, or considered high functioning, they kind of fall through the cracks.
Okay.
Because they're not that, their level of need is not that significant where they qualify for all the different social services that may be available out there for them. And there's also that desire to be independent that he has. So he resists the help sometimes. And it's a matter of just giving him his space to be his own person and being there to support your child when you can, and in the way that they need at the moment when they need it.
Yeah. And I'm learning more about the transition out of high school. When I taught, as I said, I was mostly in buildings that were, the highest level was 8th grade. And I really didn't know anything about transition until I became an IEP consultant, and then had to learn a little bit about it. And I am definitely seeing that we have to be very cognizant of teaching independence as much as an individual student can be independent, for exactly what you said. We don't want to send the child and say, okay, now you've reached your 22nd, or I don't know what it is in Florida, but here in Illinois, it's the day before their 22nd birthday. There's legislation right now that they'll be able to stay until the end of that school year.
That would be huge. Yeah.
Yeah. But whatever is their last, that we're not saying, okay, bye. And they've had all this support for however many years, and then it's just nothing. And like you said, I would think that's where the challenge is now what? And
a perfect example of the, you don't know what it is you don't know. Even as an advocate, I did not know as much about transition planning and about transition needs. And I came to learn the hard way with my own child when they presented to me at one of the IEP meetings. They said, oh, and for the next meeting, do you need us to invite somebody from Voc Rehab? And it wasn't really explained to me what vocational rehab was. And I understood it to be tech school, like just putting them in a technical college. And so I said, no, that's okay. Thanks. We don't need them to come, because my child has aspirations to go to college and I want him to be able to try his hand at that. Turned out that vocational rehab offered so many other additional services and supports, and that I did end up ultimately finding these things out and got them involved, and had to take him on my own. And there were just so many different services that they helped him with, including support at the college and support with college, support with my son doesn't drive, so he would take the bus. I taught him to take the public transportation when I can't take him to school, and they provided him bus passes. And they, there's all those little nuances of different supports that are out there that unless you know to ask for them, it's not always so easily found out there. You have to dig a little bit, and it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be that hard, but it is sometimes.
I agree with you that I feel like we need to do a better job. And I think in a lot of times that the education people feel that they're condescending if they try to explain things because they don't want to make the parents feel that they don't know. But at the same time, we have to figure out a better approach as to, like you said, first time.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. The first time I heard vocational rehabilitation, I was the same way. I'm like, oh, that's like a tech school. It's like he's going to go into a vocation rather than college. So I would have done the same thing that you did, but it's one of those terms that because I'm in my head and I know what I'm thinking, that doesn't necessarily translate the same in your head. So how do we figure out that I'm not being condescending? I just want to make sure that you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. And in that case in particular, his ESE case manager, his special ed case manager, the poor guy, he himself just didn't know. And that's what he does every day. And he didn't know how to explain it properly. And he didn't even understand all the different supports that were out there through the vocational rehabilitation program and all the different services that they offered. And so once I found those things out on my own, I went back and I let him know, like, hey, by the way, just so that you know, this is what I was able to get for Will, and this is what he's going to be doing. And they're supporting him. They've determined that he's capable of going through college, and that the career field that he'd like to go into that would require a college degree, they're going to support him through that and try and help him, encourage him. He had no idea. So it was a matter of sharing that information, and I didn't assume that they didn't share this information with me out of malice or neglect or anything like that. He genuinely just did not know himself. Right.
Yeah. And that goes back to that book. I mean, it's just, and your books on your shelf, I would almost think, unless all you did was focus on all the definitions because that's what some of this book is too, is just defining all of those things. It's impossible for one person to know all of that stuff. And I hope that, and it sounds like he was open to receive, hey, this is what this means, this is what I found. Because I know sometimes that can be a barrier as well, is that as an educator, we get like, oh, I'm supposed to know all this stuff and I can't act like I don't know this. And, I'm not going to receive anything else because then it looks like, I'm negligent or whatever.
Right.
So we're getting ready to wrap up. So I want to make sure that if anybody wants to be able to get a hold of you, let them know how they would do that.
It's just, I'm on Facebook, I'm on social media, on Instagram, and my website, sandysanteiro.com or Sandy Santeiro, SANTEIRO @gmail.com. And I'm definitely available to help families. I've primarily helped families in the state of Florida. It just so happens that way because that's where I am in Florida. But I do have some families that I work with in Georgia, North Carolina, California. I help families from all over.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad I didn't try to say your last name because I would not have said it properly. So I'm glad I just said this is Sandy.
Yeah, that's fine. And I never get upset if someone pronounces my name in a different way. That doesn't bother me at all. So.
Well, again, I'm so excited for our conference in a few months that we get to meet in person. But I'm super thrilled, and thank you. So grateful that you were with me today and willing to share your story. I hope that you got to tell the story that you wanted to tell, and we will see you all next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Yep.